Hello. For the newest episode of the AS for Architecture podcast, I was joined by Piers Gough and Sophie Ryder, both of CZWG. Piers is the original G, the OG of CZWG, and it is for that we spoke, a firm he founded in 1975 with Nick Campbell, Rex Wilkinson and Roger Zogolovich. CZWG turned 50 years old this year. Their work was at the vanguard of the postmodern movement in the UK, with notable projects in the 80s and 90s instrumental in the urban regeneration game, as public taste moved on from ahistorical modernism towards a sort of playful contextualism, not least in London Docklands, where they played their part in redefining the city's east, including at China Wharf and the Circle in Bermondsey, and at Cascades on the Isle of Dogs, and where 4 of their buildings have now been listed. More recent work has built on and around this legacy, and the practice continues to deliver large-scale urban and urbane projects that look back as they go on. Piers and Sophie bookend the practice, so we discuss all this in a hybrid sort of way, but as we know, difference makes strange, and strange makes for lovely conversation.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another new episode of A is for Architecture. I am honoured and delighted to be talking today to the great and venerable architect Sophie Ryder, Piers Gough, and Sophie Ryder of CZWG. Piers, Sophie, thanks for instigating this and on the occasion of your 50th anniversary. Yeah. Not as a couple, but as a practice. This is becoming very awkward. Anyway, before we go into talking about your work, the work of CZWG over these last 50 years, Piers, Sophie, would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Piers Gough. I'm a founding partner of CZWG, and I'm still doing it.
That's it.
Yeah.
1975.
Yes, that's the official start of CZWG, that particular 4 initials. But in fact, we had a sort of precursor firm that was called Wilkinson, Calvert and Gough, which was started in 1968 when we were students at the AA. And my partner, Roger Zogolovich, had, except he was called Calvert at the time, rather muddlingly, but he had good connections into the rag trade. And there were a lot of clothes shops in London that wanted to become boutiques. And so we got these nice jobs converting shops into boutiques, which meant bringing them into the 60s. This is 1968. What happened was the school had a spare studio that they never used in a basement across Bedford Square. And we sort of went over there and just took it on as our office. By a piece of unbelievable luck, there was a working telephone there. Now, that may sound archaic to everybody, but that was the really important element of having an office, was that there was already a telephone going there. And so we set up our firm. Instead of going to work for another architect for our year out, we worked for ourselves and did these shops, as well as sort of aunties' houses, extensions and other things that young architects tend to get up to.
What took you into architecture to begin with? Do you have a background? Do you have family history in architecture?
No, my father was a public school schoolmaster, taught physics. But when he retired at 60, he became a sculptor, and for the next 30 years, he was a rather successful sculptor. My mother was a watercolor artist, but she turned to being an interior designer. So it was in the family, the sort of artistic angle. And they were going to call me Piers Inigo Gough after the famous architect. But unfortunately, the initials would have been PIG, and they freaked out at the font. In fact, it was the chaplain who said, "Have you realized what the initials are?" And they went, "Oh my God," and changed right there and then, changed my middle name. And sadly, I think.
What is your middle name now?
William. It was
Oh,
named after my grandfather, but I think they wanted to have an architect. Yeah, and indeed, when I was 16, my dad said you should be an architect, and so did my art master. So I thought, well, that's it. Then I probably have to be.
Sophie, follow that.
Yeah.
Well, my name's Sophie, and I've been at CZWG for 5 years now, so 10% of their long life. Well, yeah, used to go to Kent University, where Ambrose is obviously now head of the department.
Not even close.
Head of,
Yeah,
head of, yeah, go on. What's your full title?
No, the full title is course lead. So, Sophie, and how is working at CZWG now? Because obviously things must have changed quite a bit, even in the 5 years, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, in the 5 years since I've been here, we have shrunk in size. But if anything, it's probably it's a better space for me personally. The smaller the practice, the more input I get in things. So
yeah.
I get the great honor of working very closely with Piers day to day. So yeah, no, I love it. I'm very proud to work at CZ. It's a practice that I feel like we can quite comfortably say we're very different, and we stand out of a crowd.
Yeah, for sure. When we were first discussing this podcast and we spoke online about it, you mentioned that, Piers, that there hasn't been a significant book, monograph of any description really written about your practice, which is kind of mind-blowing because you've been incredibly important in the kind of late 20th and early 21st century as architects. Why do you think there hasn't been that focus on your practice? Is it because it's a continuing thing? Is it because you remain kind of live, so to speak?
I think when we were sort of enfant terrible, or as we like to think, enfant terribly nice, we were published. There's a book called English Extremists. It coincided with an exhibition in 1988. So it was called 68 to 88. And so we had been sort of at it for 20 years, including student time. And it had some pretty good writers, apart from anybody. Jonathan Meads contributed an essay. And at that moment, 88, some of our buildings were sort of the ones that are now listed were getting built. And there were cranes, and it was all really exciting. And we were, I think, turning on a whole generation of people to the idea that architecture didn't have to be quite as straight and as straight up as it didn't have to be quite so heavily theory laden either, and that you could practice with pleasure and indeed look to the pleasure principle for some of the sort of delights of architecture as well as its sort of functional and practical side. And that coincided with an exhibition at the RIBA drawings collection, which was fun to do and had a crash taxi in it and pieces of cheese and all sorts of things, and all our drawings rolled up and put into a vitrine of rolled drawings, so you couldn't see what was on them. There was just hundreds of them, and we really misbehaved and rather kind of enhanced our reputation for carelessness, if you like, with that exhibition at the RABA.
I like this idea of carelessness. This is carelessness towards the kind of expectations of what it is to be an architect, which includes not only your behavior, but also the forms of architecture that you head towards.
Yeah, I think what people ask what sort of bound the four of us together originally, and originally it was the same sense of humor. I think we all four of us found the same thing, the same pretensions of architecture. It's funny. And that kind of meant that four really very disparate people could operate together with all kinds of different backgrounds. Some were very good at detailing, some at conceptualizing, some at being kind of high-handed. And what it was supposed to look like was it was effortless. This was the kind of impression we were trying to give, is all these sweaty architects sort of telling you how hard they worked and how they looked at all these things and options, and then we worked through all things, and the brief's so important and the relationship with that. Forget all that. Just say, this is fun to do. And look, hey, buildings can be colourful. So that was our rather nonchalant attitude. Although I think our sort of humor was quite rigorous, but of course we weren't going to show that. That was pedaling under the water, or what, it was that swan thing, pedaling, pedaling like mad under the water, but on the surface of it appearing to be not being any difficulty to it at all.
There's a sort of definition of elegance, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
I think that's really interesting. What was the inspiration behind this in your own training? I mean, who at the AA, and who, I mean, I assume your parents were instrumental in this. Well, it's sort of two questions, isn't it? Because there's going to be a carrot and a stick. What was the context in which you were operating that needed to be kicked against?
The modernist movement, by and large, are the tutors at the AA would quote Corb as if he was in the next room. Everything was Corb this, Corb that, and occasionally Mies the other, and the previous generation, even at the AA, even the people just ahead of us were proper architect, what I call proper architects, ones who cared about social matters and went on to work for Ted Cullinan and so on. Now, however, the AA was a very fabulously exciting place because Peter Cook was in charge of fifth year, and Elia Zengalis of Future set up Omar with Rem. He was in charge of first year. So we arrived in the first year. We get Elia, who's like red hot on Russian constructivism. So you've got both amazing engineering form and color. And he's sort of showing us these slides and blowing our minds, basically. And we're thinking, we really don't want to be housing architects. We really don't want to be very worthy architects. We don't want to be basically modern movement architects. What we really want to be is pop artists, because when you go down the road to Royal College of Art, the pop artists are having a lot more fun, and seem to be, anyway, on the face of it, having a life which is extremely agreeable. They're popular, people like their work, it's colourful, and how about architecture be like that? So that sort of mixes up vernacular inspirations and kind of regular architecture necessities. It wasn't until 1971 when we left the AA that the Venturis published their famous Complexity and Contradiction, and that was like perfect because that was the manifesto. We didn't have to write it. Conveniently, they'd written exactly what we've been doing, but we'd been doing it in innocence as sort of students. We'd looked to that sort of idea of complexity and contradiction, and so it was great when that book came out. It was like, right, okay, that puts it into words. Thanks.
I guess the context of central London, or London as a whole at that time, must have been also something of a kind of inspiration, not only because it was quite derelict, really, but also because the modernist dictums had sort of failed.
Well, yeah, there were still wonderful things, Alexander Road, National Theatre, the big stuff was still fabulously exciting, brilliant. And I was, we always have been a huge fan of the Barbican, the complexity of it. And I never thought I could do it, though. I just never thought my brain could cope with such complexities. I've always wanted to keep it a little more straightforward. And those multi-level things, which I really like, the idea of the three-dimensional city with different levels, never managed to even hardly vaguely achieve it, partly through just somehow the difficulty of it, the impossibility of it. But yeah, what we wanted to be inspired by was anything but other architecture. We were looking towards art, music, all the things that the rest of the culture, if you like, fashion, and not so much what other architects had done. And what was great about the AA, I have to say, is this, although the tutors were all immersed in modernism, like Eldred Evans was one of my tutors, they were prepared to stand back and let us do it and look at us and think, well, maybe this is the next thing. And then made us more rigorous about it. You must explain it. You must explain it, explain it, because you'll never get away with it if you can't explain it. And that was what the AA taught us, was how to stand up and explain our work to each other.
Sophie, what was your impression of CZWG when you started? What did you know of them? Were you aware when you were applying for a job that they had this kind of reputation, this storied history as well?
So I was super naive when I came out of part one, and I just assumed that, if you won the AJ 100, you were the be all and end all of good architecture. And I actually didn't apply to CZ. I got put forward by my second year tutor, whose their wife was working at CZ at the time. So I was very fortunate enough to actually be put forward for it. And I so did some quick Googling and went, oh gosh, they're on the AJ 100. They're pretty high up as well. Sold. There I am. Take me now. But yeah, obviously, I now know how naive that was of me. But was incredibly fortunate to end up at CZ, because they are one of the practices on the AJ 100 that is, exactly my cup of tea for architecture. Bold, beautiful, creative, striking.
Yeah.
Everything I want. So yeah, very fortunate.
And there's something for me as well about the work of CZWG, even the early stuff and over the decades, which is very kind of connected to the contemporary culture of imagery. The idea of the architectural form as necessarily aesthetic. Is that a fair description, Piers? Is that a fair description, Sophie? Because you're like well into Instagram and social media. And I wonder whether there is something about that as well as the way that CZWG's work, to me, can be comprehended quite quickly.
Yeah, it's all about iconography, and like I literally went to the Circle project last week, so I had a meeting very close to it. And it doesn't even take time or effort to take a good photo of that building. All you got to do is put your phone up, click, and it looks perfect. There's other projects where you have to really line it up, get the grid on your photo, make sure you've got the right angle, all the verticals. And I just literally took the photo and I was like, well, gosh, you can't beat it, can you?
The Circle is very, very wonderful in general, but for that as well, because it's really difficult to take photographs of the Barbican, for example, because it's so bloody massive. You can't actually. Yeah. Piers, how do you situate the early decades of your practice's work within the broader postmodern movement? Did you ever consider yourselves as postmodern, or was this a moniker that kind of has been applied?
No, I think we were definitely probably almost the only architects to own up to being postmodern. Most architects are too proud and too specific and say, oh, yes, I'm not really a postmodernist because, my particular work is far more important and can't be pigeonholed, and you should look at all the context and, blah, 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 blah. And postmodern, of course, got a really bad name in architecture, not much in other subjects, postmodern writing or postmodern music or postmodern art, it's all fine and it has remained fine in a way. But postmodern architecture did attract some of the most crappy kind of versions of it, where people would add a kind of very banal pediment shape onto a horrible modernist hotel building with tiny windows and that got called postmodern, and so it damned us all. I mean, what I used to say is that postmodern is actually much more difficult than modernism, because it's difficult not to get it wrong.
Yes.
You can easily use the vocabulary of postmodernism, make a complete hash of it, and make really unpleasant and trying to be ingratiating buildings that are trying to be ingratiating but failing miserably by being so banal, and so it got a really bad name, but it was too late for us. We were just branded that way. We were never going to run away, never pretend not to be, and we somehow there were more high-minded postmodernists who hated the term, like Terry Farrell, Dixon Jones, John Outram. They all were particular architects who really didn't like to be called postmodern. So, in fact, it was something of a kind of cheeky chappy thing to say, oh, well, actually, we are.
How would you define it if you were asked to then and now, I suppose?
Postmodernism was allowing the lesson of some lessons of history, but also just some freedom of expression into the sort of form no longer had to follow function. Form could follow more whimsical notions about context, more whimsical notions about the zeitgeist of the time, such that, at one moment, modernism and Art Deco were kind of parallel things. And this is the same really with postmodernism. It was a parallel thing. I mean, a lot of the planning of the buildings was modernist, but the expression was allowed to free itself up, and the plethora of materials. So it didn't just have to be steel, glass, and concrete. There were other materials in the world, and you could use them.
Yeah, to quote Piers back to himself, he said, modernism says that all buildings have to be flat roofed and white, whereas postmodernism says you can have anything you want, which is exactly what Piers does every day.
This playfulness that you've talked about, this kind of pleasure, I suppose one of the major criticisms of postmodernism that I've come across, or one of the most sort of loudly articulated, is that it sort of lacked the seriousness in the context of the crisis of the mid and late 20th century. Compared with modernism that had sort of put its shoulder to the wheel of kind of trying to address social concerns and sort of essentially politicize the discipline, give the discipline this moral obligation to be good, to be a citizen. The criticism of postmodernism is that it was
sort of mucking around, really.
Yeah,
not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah, flippant. Yes, I agree. That's true. I think what postmodernism didn't, or good postmodernism didn't do, was to revert to the sort of classical order of things, where you have palaces and then lesser buildings and lesser buildings and then buildings for poor people. And one of the things that modernism was brilliant at was to level the field and say the architecture is the same, however, whatever strata of society you're in, you're going to get the same thing. And that, to me, was why Poundbury is so disgusting, is because it's about hierarchy. And the one thing we've never given into is, as it were, doing a postmodernism that's about hierarchy. Everything is enjoyable at every level for whoever we're doing it for. And that's, I think, really where we don't diverge from modernism, is that we don't reintroduce hierarchy into buildings. And indeed, I really dislike planning authorities who tell us that some of our buildings must have a hierarchy. And what's the hierarchy of spaces? And I go, no, every space is for everyone, effectively. They may use them more or less, but they're all for everyone. And we try to carry our social conscience as much as we've like to think. We haven't got any lesser social conscience. It's just that we're carrying it more lightly and not imposing it, as it were, as a kind of disciplinarians on the users of our buildings. And of course, we can't say we've done as much social housing as we'd like to have done. But
was this idea right at the beginning? I mean, was this part of your conversations with the other founding partners of CZWG? Was this part of what you were trying to do, that there was this kind of ethical framework in which you were redeploying this subjective sense, but also this palette of options that history have provided us with?
No, I don't think so. I think we weren't that theoretical, and I don't think complexity and contradiction is, as I remember it, doesn't particularly go into that aspect. I think we were all naturally, like people are, particularly young people, and liberal-minded, and wanted to do good for everyone as much as we could, within architecture, which is a rather arcane way of doing people any good. But it is one that we wanted to do, even in spite of the fact we work for developers, and as much as it would have been lovely to work on more public projects, they weren't the ones that found us attractive. Public authorities, I think, took one look at CZWG and thought, these boys are too naughty. We're not serious enough. And although we did have some bites at, say, the National Gallery extension and one or two other public things, we were, generally thought of as being sort of, perhaps not suitable for big public works.
But why do you think commercial developers did find you attractive?
Because we made housing sexy. I think what happened really, let's be honest, in the 80s is that the individual became very much the thing, and housing seemed to be the least individualistic thing on the market. It was very much you fitted in with a sort of social norm, and you lived in a terrace of houses, and the whole point was that all the houses looked the same, and everything was, sort of background wallpaper of the city. And we determined to make buildings that were in themselves, as you now described, Instagrammable, but yes, memorable. So you said, "Oh, I lived in China Wharf," and people would say, "Wow, you live in that building." That was a thing. Where you lived became a kind of marker, and that was sort of a new idea in a funny way. It's a new thing to make housing stand out in the city rather than be the background of the city, like China Wharf and the Circle and Cascades, which was this very idiosyncratic piece of high-rise that was memorable as could be. People just knew what Cascades was, and so the people who lived there could say, "Well, I live in Cascades," and people, "Oh, wow," And that was part of it, was to change housing from being, the background to something more important in the city. And that's why developers liked us, I think.
Do they still like you?
No, not so much, really. They're not maverick enough. The industry's turned very serious, and of course, we're older people, and by and large, I think developers like people who are roughly the same age. So when we were started out, some of our developers were actually a little bit younger than us, so in their 20s, and they really got it. And unfortunately for us, a number of our best, most frequent developers have unfortunately retired, or even more unfortunately died. So I think we find it a little harder. Just a wee bit harder, but we have happily got younger partners now, and they attract, different people.
Yes.
Happily, we're still seen as a sort of interesting firm to work with.
I met an architect at a cocktail party very suitably, and I asked him what Docklands was like during the 80s. He said it was like the Wild West. You could just kind of build stuff. It's a contemporary context more allergic to the kind of speculative, aesthetically and formally speculative work of a practice like CZWG. I mean, even were the developers there, even were the money there, do you think that within the context of planning and urban planning and God forfend placemaking, would the kind of radical work, I suppose, of CZWG actually find a place?
Yeah, well, we were lucky insofar as the London Docklands Development Corporation was the planning authority for the docks, because fundamentally the various local authorities adjacent to the river couldn't bring themselves to give in to the pressure for residential versus blue collar work, and they wanted to replace all the blue collar work that they'd lost through the docks moving down to down river, and therefore the government realized that it was just an impasse and they needed to stir it up, and they did, and they offered perhaps far too many incentives, but they offered incentives to go to particularly Canary Wharf and around there. Weirdly, our very first Cascades was given permission by Tower Hamlets, actually. Before the LDDC came into existence, funnily enough. But obviously the LDC were very good to us insofar as they were had 4 people on the planning committee, one of whom was an architect, and there was no sign of democracy. Not, but it did mean that we could get on with it, and they were open to new ideas, and that was sort of the key element. And indeed, they liked us enough to actually commission us themselves for a small project in Docklands. So we had the right the lucky coexistence of a rather strong planning department that wanted interesting things to happen. They'd all actually come from Milton Keynes, and thought that Docklands was going to be like Milton Keynes again, but got a bit of a surprise when the various developers, including, of course, Canary Wharf developer John, what was he called, Travelstead, turned up and said, "I'm going to build tower blocks." And they went, "Oh, okay, here we go, yellow brick road, but with tower blocks." So that was good to us, and I think that helped us, really get going.
Yeah. Ted Hollenby was involved in the LDDC.
Yes.
And he was intimately involved in Thamesmead.
Yeah.
He was involved in Thamesmead. How did someone like him, who came off the back of this high modernist, brutalist, top-down tradition, respond to the work of CZWG at the time? Did they hold their nose and sort of wave it through, or was there a kind of recognition in those actors that the game was changing and they needed to change with it?
I think there was quite an element of that for Ted. He was obviously he'd built a lot of social housing, and it was a bit of a shock, and indeed his own office was on the north bank of the Thames, just exactly opposite where China Wharf was intended to be, and he was pretty shocked by our proposition for the riverfront, anyway, particularly of China Wharf. And to avoid embarrassment, he sent us off to the Royal Fine Art Commission, so that they could say no, and it would save him the trouble. So we went to the Royal Fine Art Commission, and by good fortune had people there who were really trying to steer us past St. John Stevens, and managed to put us on the committee that he wasn't on. And they gave us the thumbs up on the same basis as the sort of tutors at the AA saw the future and thought, we should step out of the way here. We should let this happen, almost regardless of what we really feel about it. So then Ted had me into his office and said, "Look, I accept what the Royal Fine Arts are saying, but you've got to take one floor off." And I said to him, "Ted, I think you invented scissors flats." He went, "Oh, yes, I did. I invented scissors flats." I said, "Well, we need an even number of floors. You can't take one off. You have to take 2. And he went, "Oh, dear boy, you're quite right. Yes, well, of course, it's fine." Because I'd flattered him. You invented scissors flats. Of course he didn't, but, he wanted me to think he did.
There's a business acumen there. I am assuming, going right back to the beginning, I'm assuming that CZWG, to sustain for 50 years, you must be quite good at the business of architecture, the relational aspects of it. What would you put the sustaining of CZWG down to? I mean, obviously there's the architecture, which speaks for itself, but there's been lots of good architects who've gone to the wall.
Yeah, well, that I understand why, it's not only being good, it is who you know as well as being actually good at it. But one of the things, the interesting things about CZ was that Roger Zogolovich, Nick Campbell, and Rex Wilkinson came at architecture from the kind of detailed end in a funny way. And although Rex was one of the best conceptualizers of buildings imaginable, he would chew his knuckles to get the best possible details. And Roger, in the early days when we were all on the drawing boards, and Roger and Nick were detailing buildings, and they could detail. I mean, they knew how a building worked. And I was probably the most cavalier, the one who was most like, well, which way does the damp-proof course go? Oh, Jesus, I can't remember. But, they were particularly good at detailing. And so we've always had this grounding of being good when it comes down to the nitty-gritty. We cover it, without a lot of fuss. We just do it. Do it right, and that's been a bit of a calling card, although a rather hidden one, that developers got to know us in the end, that we were kind of reliable and knew what we were doing, rather than just what we appeared to be, or even gave the impression of, which is sort of pretty boys doing attractive buildings.
Last 5mm kind of territory.
Yeah.
How does the design process work in your practice? I think there's a sense, certainly in the earlier work, that collage plays a role, whether, active collage, but this idea of collaging ideas and motifs and forms together to create these buildings. Was there a kind of technique to how you produced these things? And a question I'd been thinking about earlier is, to do postmodernism well, does it rely upon a detailed understanding of historical precedent? Do you have to know a lot of stuff? And do you get crappy postmodernism because basically people don't know a lot of stuff? Yeah, so how does that process work?
Well, I think we're not really architects who add a lot of sort of twiddly bits to our buildings. That's not really how we are postmodern. We're rather bolder than that. We tend to do bigger forms and big gestures. Although, for instance, the balconies of Dundee Wharf, which Rex designed, all look like mini cranes, So you can say at that level of detail, yeah, okay, we're sort of adapting something taken from Docklands buildings and making it into a useful thing for a residential scheme. Dundee Wharf's a good example of a billboard, as Rex designed it, a billboard building, with two major facades looking down the river and upriver. And then this sort of corner element balconies that look like a bit like the Eiffel Tower. So there are collages of images taken from different places. And of course, a lot of it comes from fairly close context, like Docklands, was offering lots of context. Before it all got very lazy and everybody says, oh, there's industrial buildings on this site, therefore I justify my boring industrial lump of brick building with brittle windows in it. That's, before that, we were trying to do something much more lively with the like ocean liner imagery of Cascades or and so on. So that sort of context is why, you shouldn't really look at our work without some understanding of context, I think, where we got stuff from. Yeah.
Yes, the practice in Docklands that perhaps I see most closely, and there's, I think, only one piece by them in Docklands, is Corrigan Sounding and Killaditty, who did Elephant Lane. But there's another aspect to this, which you alluded to, I think, earlier, which is this idea of community, or the kind of the common appetites of everyday life, of normal people. And I know normal people is a kind of weird and probably probably somewhere problematic kind of phrase. How did CZWG sort of engage with the public in their design work? And has that been perhaps one of the legacies that has carried on in later years? That's a leading question.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see, when we were at the AA, none of us wanted to do housing at all. It seemed utterly kind of repetitive and annoying, and it meant you had to put lots and lots of windows in, and you couldn't do pop art because it was all very prosaic. And so when we were at college, we were busily designing things that were anything but, because you could make the building look like a camera, or you could make the building look like a pyramid, or whatever it was that you were, you could willfully make form. And then once you get into residential, the form starts to come out of necessity, and once you start putting a lot of windows in, pop art kind of slightly goes out the window, and you have to find other way. Once you've got lintels and things, oh my God, so there's that aspect. So we didn't expect to be doing tons of housing, which we've ended up doing, major, housing-led schemes, but this notion of doing things for communities is such a lie, because of course, if we're going to build some modern flats, there's nobody around who's ever going to live in one. They're not living nearby. Why would they be? They're already got flats or whatever. So it's a sort of phony to my mind. Now, if you were doing a estate renewal, which we haven't done any of, by and large, then you could go and consult people who are going to move back into what you do. But in case of sort of just consulting the neighbours, that seems to me to be asking for NIMBYism, really, to giving it a big thing. So what we try and do is make nice buildings anyway, so that when it's all finished, they go, what were we complaining about? Oh, yeah, no, well, perhaps, does look quite good. That's what our attitude has been, as I'm afraid. It doesn't look good. It's not Hunt Thompson and all that lot who all go around having endless weekends of community engagement. No, we can't pretend we do that. Of course, we exhibit our work in advance, and people can come and criticize it, and some of us hang out there and answer questions and so on. But it's not really influenced very much by other people, other than the planners, who have a far too big a say in what we do.
Do you think so, Sophie?
Yeah, don't get me started on the planners.
No.
I have to bite my tongue every single time we're in a meeting, trying to design too much, and they've just got such a buzzword where it's all about in keeping with the context. And part of CZWG's USP is the fact that we do design hopefully out of the norm and a little bit different to the cookie cutter things you see going up everywhere. So when they're like, oh, it's not very in keeping, we're like, well, you're trying to get rid of who we are as designers, and what's made our name and what's got us 6 listed buildings. We had a conversation today in the office about if our 6 listed buildings went to planning today, would they go through? And probably not any of them would go through, because they are different. They don't keep with the context, but they're listed for a reason now. So it's just the planners are so scared of doing things different now, that you can't help but lose a little bit of the edge of the design as it goes through the planning system.
But there's an interesting idea, isn't there, that underpins, I think, what you're saying, which is that the architect has a kind of an obligation to be the architect. And you can kind of pretend that you are an agent of social justice, or you can be the architect. And you can kind of take ownership of the responsibility and, I guess, in a way, the kind of exposure that brings with you, which is kind of threatening. It's kind of challenging for an architect to say, no, I did this. This is me. And this was my response to this.
Yeah, well, it's like all art in life, you're opening yourself up for criticism, aren't you? But, our clients employ us because they've seen our work. They like our work. It's what they're paying for. And then as soon as you get to planning, planners are trying to design that for you. And it's like, well, no longer we're doing what we're getting paid to do, because, taking it away from us.
Piers, is this
Yeah.
something that you have been kind of aware of, that this authorship, this aesthetic and architectural language that you propose is kind of not just challenging to the public at large, but it's kind of challenging to yourself? How do you kind of cope with that?
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
it takes a lot of confidence. It's much easier to do kind of, say, well, it looks like it is because of Passive House, or it looks like it is because of
Yeah.
planning policy, or it looks like it is
Yeah.
because of BREEAM excellent rating. It's like,
That's a really good question, actually. But there's an itch that has to be scratched, isn't there? That's really what it's like. Perhaps little known, we won a competition to master plan the Gorbals in Glasgow, and just before we even knew about this project, they demolished a whole lot of Basil Spence tower blocks. We won a competition in Glasgow to design the Gorbals master plan, which had Basil Spence tower blocks, which had been demolished. And that, of course, we had no part in the demolition or refurb options of that. We were just asked to replan the land. It was a tabula rasa, except there were actually 2 tower blocks left. Because one of them had a local councillor lived in it, and he liked his tower block, so they compromised and left them there. They've now demolished them because he's dead, but before, while he was still alive, they had to keep. Anyway, we came up with this sort of town planning idea of the reverse hierarchy of streets, and that was you make the everyday street that most people live on the widest, and then the high street with the shops you make narrower. So instead of doing the normal way round, which is the high street's a wide street, and then you have smaller streets off it, we did the widest streets everybody lives on, and the narrow street for a little more intensity and feeling of town. So and then you put the cars on the very narrowest streets. You put the cars in a mews width of street, and this was a kind of bold idea, and it's perverse, in one way. It's exactly the opposite to the ways cities are planned, and I thought it was brilliant, and therefore I fought and fought and fought for it. We did win the competition, and then we had to battle with actual people who, were put in charge of running the project, and battle with them to keep the idea going, keep it. And we came up with this concept of you plant 1,000 trees before you even start. You don't even think about how you're going to put the roads in. You just plant trees in what you've got, and then you move them if you need to. All sorts of ways of approaching a town master plan that other people have never picked up on. We never got another job doing a master plan. Oh, we did actually. We did a competition for something called Granton, which is just outside Edinburgh, Scotland, the only place that accepted our master planning skills. And that it's sort of all I'm trying to show you is that we didn't have to do that. We could have done what everyone else sort of does, which is a conventional hierarchy of streets. But no, being us, we had to have a perverse thought and then think, what? It's a great, it is perverse, but it's terrific. It really worked. And we introduced them to the Maida Vale, where you have these big communal gardens behind the flats, and you put all the cars in the street, because in Glasgow at that time you always parked in the backland, and so you looked out your front window and those cars, and you looked out the back window and more cars, and we reversed that and put all the cars in the street, and made these big gardens at the back. And they went, oh, they're useless because the weather's not good enough in Glasgow. Well, it is now.
It is indeed. What's been the legacy of CZWG's founding visions in the practice today? And I guess that's a question both for Piers reflecting back, but Sophie, as you experience it now.
I think the legacy is in other practices, and various people have mentioned to me that they sat around with their future partners and thought, well, if those guys can do it, then so can we. And that I don't think it's giving too much away to, or would they would be cross if I said it's, AHMM and Hawkins Brown and Egbert West. They're all firms that kind of, actually Egbert West's more post Will Alsop, of course, but that kind of, we gave them a signal, which was, hey, you can do much more interesting architecture than perhaps the world is ready for. You can do stuff. You can enjoy yourself and make enjoyable buildings and make them attractive to the public and so on. Now, in truth, many of them have exceeded us. I mean, Simon Henley of Henley Haley-Brown, he used to work in our office, not for very long, but he worked here, and they've shot past us because they've managed to be much more eclectic about their work, what work they do, and that was, I would say, our legacy is limited a bit because we didn't broaden our typologies when the going was really good. We should have entered more competitions, done more education, done more public buildings, done all sorts of things, which we didn't do because we were too busy, as it were. But that's how I see our legacy. Our legacy was sort of a turn on particularly in the 80s, 90s, and other firms looked at us and thought, we can do that. We can do better than that. But I think we gave them a sort of carte blanche to experiment and be more experimental and more brave, as it were.
Do you think that you have also had an impact outside the profession on the built environment? Because obviously most of the built environment doesn't involve authored architects. Do you think, for example, and I don't say this in any sense critically, do you think, for example, the emergence of a kind of popular vernacular in, for example, volume house building has in a way got its inspiration out of a practice like your own?
I don't think they give us a moment's thought. I mean, I think, we're just a scratch. I mean, although we've done a lot of buildings, we're not famous. We're not we're not famous amongst developers even. We're not. Most of them go, who? Who? We've got a bit of small fame in a kind of rarefied zone of architects and maybe a few planners who pay attention, but by and large, we're sort of minor players in the sort of covering the countryside with little boxes. I really don't think you can lay them at our door one way or the other. I really don't, and I think that's too tough on us. You can call us Thatcher's children, which would be a calumny because she was in charge, but not my prime minister, as they say.
Mm-hmm. But I was just thinking about a place like Beckton, obviously also part of the London Docklands development area, where if you walk through it, and I have had that pleasure a number of times, and you compare it to what was happening under the GLC before the LDDC popped up, which was very often, I mean, we've got the Neve Browns and so on and so forth like that, but actually most of it was kind of boring as hell. Suburbanite, pastiche, incredibly modest, as I say, just really boring. And then you get at Beckton, which happens after CZWG are doing their thing, you start getting these giant porticos and you round windows and strange motifs that seem to derive from
Yeah. Well, if you like them, then we definitely were influential.
I think you're being too modest, and I think the best parts of
Piers
it
as
are.
humble as ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty obvious when you walk around, well, London anyway. Yes, I know that you have to be in the world of architecture to be able to look at a building and, pick apart its pieces and go, oh, that looks like this and that looks like that. But I think it's pretty obvious when you walk around London, you look at a building and go, yep, that looks like CZ had its hand in it.
Yeah.
And more often than not, I've looked at a building, and obviously we have too many projects for me to keep track of, and a lot of them that predated me, and I'll look at a building and go, oh, that looks like something we would have done. Sure enough, get back to the office, look it up. Oh, we did do it. Like, I think they are very distinct, and that is part of what makes us us, and part of the legacy. We are lucky that Piers has stuck around as long as he is, and he is such a workaholic, because it does mean that more time to learn off him and everything like that. And part of us all have Piers, Rex, and Nick and Roger's design sort of ethos instilled in us. I went back to my master's after even being a part one just for a year, but I did work with Piers, and the first thing back was designing a folly, and I designed what I thought was this like groundbreaking folly with a huge cantilever in glass, inverted roof. And I sat in my intercrit, and my tutor goes, oh, that looks like something Piers Gough designs. And I went, wait, did you know where I did my part one? He was like, no. And I was like, oh, I think I was insulted at the time, because I was like, what do you mean? This was coming out of all my head. I've not copied anyone. And then, so I was quite insulted at the time, thinking, oh, you think I've just copied it off Piers? Whereas now I'm like, if anyone sort of said my work looks like Piers Gough, I'd be like, oh, great. Like, what a compliment. Spend my day thinking, oh, what would Piers Gough do? Because, it's all about pushing sort of the norms, and what you think looks completely jarring on a sheet of paper when you've drawn it in plan, and think, oh gosh, that would never work in the real world, or just doesn't fit that grid formation that you'd like to think developers like, and all of this. And then you model it up, or it gets built, and you're like, oh, you know what, I was wrong. Piers is right. Piers is always right. It doesn't have to be.
Do you think though that I mean, we're, as I said earlier, we're in the postmodern period, if it's even referenceable. Do you think that kind of spirit, that kind of anarchic, I suppose, atmosphere, particularly in relation to modern design techniques, is still possible? I guess I'm interested to know whether you think modern design in your practice, contemporary design in your practice, is possible to kind of do that kind of anarchic practice that characterized the early years of your work, early decades. Because I'm looking, for example, at Victoria Hall, which to me, student housing, there seems to be quite clear references to earlier work. But then other stuff, perhaps, it's more difficult to see the kind of lineage.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it is tougher. We're not always consistently kind of pushing the boat out, if you like. But I don't feel very, and I must admit, I don't feel very part of the current obsessions with mud bricks, really. Single story buildings, which the press, architectural press, I don't think the Architectural Review has reviewed a building over one story for about the last 5 years. They've completely given up on scale and the necessity for housing a lot of people. It's all gone down to back extensions, and the RIBA hands out awards, for sort of small houses all over the place. I've slightly lost the plot, I think, because it seems to me that the sort of current obsessions of the architectural profession are avoiding all the big issues, but I say they're covering the climate change, which is the biggest issue, but all the other big issues are sort of just going by the board, all the difficult ones.
Yeah, for sure. Charles Holland wrote on LinkedIn, right, quite a long post I think over the weekend or perhaps even this morning, about this and his experience of the Venice Architecture Biennale, which he visited for the opening, I think, and how the Spanish pavilion was very architecture and was great. And yet this other stuff that's there felt to him to be sort of eschewing the obligation again, the possibility of architecture to operate as architecture, which I think is kind of interesting, that this is becoming quite a dominant conversation point.
There was a very good article about how all the exhibits in the Arsenale were all actually lies. For instance, the air conditioning one, where you first come in and it's very, very hot, and it's a sort of comment on air conditioning, which is a perfectly respectable point, but actually the heat was produced by radiators in the building, not the air conditioning units themselves. So you're being had, and all those exhibits, like that ridiculous one about sort of taking the water out of the lagoon and making it into coffee. Well, fine, but you could do that 200 years ago. It's not. There's nothing to it. And why you would put that on a steel structure? Steel? I mean, hello, steel structure. Sorry. Isn't that a lot of embodied carbon for nothing? Anyway, we won't go into it, but it strikes me that a lot of it, how much elephant dung is there? Is there enough to house, a desperate population that wants thousands and thousands of residential units? It all seems it's all a bit self-referential for me, and not really facing up to the difficulties of what we need to do next. So I don't feel very much part of it. I feel out of the swim, as it were, and no doubt damned for it, Yeah,
I don't think anybody's going to damn you, Piers.
I think they might. I mean, why not? It's always important to damn the previous generation, isn't it? I mean, you've got to come from somewhere, which is to dislike the previous lot. And one of the disarming aspects that I've always cultivated is that I really love the previous lot. I really love the Barbican, and it was totally something I was never going to manage myself or want to do myself. But I really respect the people who did do it, and I really enjoy being there. So that notion of liking other people's work, I think, is really important, and so I would never set our work against other styles or types or ideas or people, because I don't think that's right. I think the only thing I don't like, the only thing I really dislike is neoclassical and vernacular revival, of which Poundbury is perhaps the perfect expression of the thing I really thoroughly dislike.
Not to speak ill of the dead, but Leon Creer was not your cup of tea.
No, well, he did do town planning, as I say, without reversing the hierarchies. He kept the hierarchies, and the hierarchies is what's deadly about this country, of course, is having a king and all the awful things that come down from that, the whole noblesse oblige notion of a sort of class-ridden society, which we still are. And it's the fact that we won't leave go of it is we may have lost empire, we may have lost all sorts of things, but what we haven't lost is this ghastly taste for snobbery, and it's corroding. It's really, really corrodes our nation. And at the moment, politicians are determined to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. So this is a phenomenally bad time. I mean, it's just the most. I mean, for someone born to parents who lived through the war, who really thought we were going to have a better world, particularly under Labour, and voted Labour, their whole lives, to then finally get a Labour government that is so hateful, is quite disgusting. And if I've ever done anything that made the present situation the way it is, I'm very regretful that I've been part of a society that's allowed this to happen, as it were.
I forgive you.
Thank you so much.
Well, in my in my role of high priest and host,
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I'm sorry to go off on a diatribe, but
no, not at all.
you know, it's just the state of things, and that there is a certain sort of architecture which expresses that perfectly. It's the perfect expression of that ghastliness, and that's the one why I hate it so much.
Yes. I think if I were to kind of try and sort of describe what I think about CZWG's work, it would be that it's generous in a broad sense, and it's humorous.
Yeah.
If we were to do a Lonely Hearts for CZWG, GSOH, long walks in the countryside, actually not long walks in the city, and kind. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting from your kind, as you call it, diatribe.
Yeah.
Is that even though the architecture itself seems playful and elements of irony and so on and so forth, of these things that, you know, postmodern theorists have talked about, ultimately it seems to me to come back to this idea of a kind of respect for both the people and the space that you are at work in, which I think is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And contrasts profoundly with the increasing uniformity of contemporary architecture, which is tyrannized by planning policy and a kind of movement towards a singularity. Like motorcar design, it's becoming more and more samey.
Yeah. I love it. I love what you just said. I think that's a really nice thing to say. I agree with you entirely. That it's motorcar design is a really good example of every car looks so damn similar that you need to have a bigger and bigger badge on it. You notice, you know, the word Land Rover is written bigger and bigger and bigger, and you know because otherwise there's no differentiation. Yeah. And they all blame all the crash tests. You know, it all has to be bulbous and blobby because of crash tests, and an E-type Jag would never get through the system anymore. Whereas, in those days, an E-type Jag was quite different to a Mini, but now they look more or less the same.
Yes.
It's so weird.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's been a long time since I've seen what I would consider an exciting high-rise residential building. Obviously, what we do large-scale residential is probably some of our bread and butter these days, but, you know, it's that block that happens with, you know, being in keeping with the context and that commercially viable design that, you know, developers just aren't, you know, they haven't got an appetite for risk anymore at all. They just want something that will go through the system and get approved and they can start making money of it. It's just, you know, whereas before they might have gone to bat for a more risky, exciting design, they don't have that drive anymore to do that. So, you know, you just get this repetitive commercial residential design that is just being stamped all around London, really, of these, you know, brick towers with a recess inside a recess inside a recess.
It is really depressing.
Yeah, it's a shame. It is, you know, what's so scary about being different, and you know, the thing about originality is you do stop and it's a conversation starter. You may not like it, but it's what makes the world so good, is, you know, the difference in everyone and everything. So it's a shame that everything gets sort of, you know, tamed down and reduced.
Who are the CZWG of the present, Piers? Have you seen people that have taken on this mantle? And just as a question to finish, how do you see CZWG developing into the future? Does it involve this genetic code of anarchic behavior? And are there practices out there that are kind of approaching your way of thinking about the world?
I think most people are probably running away from it, even if they would like to do it, because it's currently sort of, let's be honest, it's sort of out of fashion. Now, I'm not saying that some of these big practices are of conformist. In fact, they do push the boat out, and they do interesting things. And there are young practices that do amazing things. And then you get Armin Taha and his phenomenal stone building, that just blows my mind. I just think that's so fabulous and such an invention and adventurous architect that I couldn't possibly think that the world's, gone all conventional. The fact that he didn't, that planning was impossible was, he overcame it, and it cost him probably about 10 years of his life and his, and his ability to sleep and all sorts of things. But he did do it, and I still think that spirit is out there, and there are people doing it, probably maybe not even known to us yet.
Maybe even sat on this podcast with you, Piers.
Yeah. No, I'm not down it, but I think CZ, it's about the people here, and while I'm still here, there's certainly that originating thing, I just don't seem to be able to grow old gracefully. But the younger members of the practice would find their own way and do their own thing and with their own clients, and they may indeed get pleasure from doing different things, get pleasure from using new technologies that I'm unable to access, and so on and so on. So I'm not we've set it up. There's a certain level of freedom. We also like to think we have a very proper office where people feel appreciated and enjoy coming to work and all those things. And that's also an important legacy, I think. It's not there's still a lot of laughter in the office. We still share a sense of humor, I think. And that's, important.
It's wonderful. That's a great point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Piers. Thank you, Sophie. It's been lovely to hear you talk.
Thank you, Ambrose.
Thanks, Ambrose. We've had fun. Let's do it again sometime.
This Imperium's eagle spreads ancient wings, as the saying goes. Friends, Romans and globalists, most dexterous ego surfers of the remotest control say go figure, let's slip the bristling clusters and gas from each harsh Doric column stabbed long and hard into a ruin of sea and dimpled air, most cleaving indifference over physical features that depict no political borders, lost upon spicy chicken wings as claws do special resolutions in pink cartoons, nails down tankers, the chalk on board thing, and the gas is all for oil, galley slave of this grade class fellow guzzling petrol 12. Double coding, Charles Jenks? Stick Drew Milne's go figure in your pipe and smoke it. Thanks to Sophie and Piers for the conversation. See the podcast description for links to CZWG at work and on the socials. Happy anniversary, and thanks for listening.